On November 19, 1953, the air in a secluded cottage on Deep Creek Lake smelled of pine needles and cold water. Inside, behind heavy curtains, the crackling fire in the fireplace couldn't mask the tense silence. Leading CIA scientists had gathered there, among them Frank Olson, a brilliant bacteriologist, and Sidney Gottlieb, the mysterious head of the entire technical services staff. At one point, Gottlieb offered his colleagues a glass of Cointreau, subtly adding a potent dose of LSD to the drink. Olson took a sip. The initial effects weren't hallucinations, but icy terror. He suddenly lost control of his own mind and realized he had been poisoned by his own people. Amidst Olson's shock and confusion, Gottlieb remained perfectly calm, simply observing. What kind of secret program was this, where scientists used each other as guinea pigs? This fateful experiment was no accident. It was a demonstration of the methods of a project we are about to uncover. Frank Olson's story is just one fragment that exposes two fundamental paradoxes upon which the entire project was built. The first paradox: the CIA's charter explicitly prohibited any operations on U.S. territory. How, then, was the agency able to secretly launch 149 sub-projects in 80 American institutions, including universities and hospitals? The answer lies in a cynical funding scheme, which will be revealed in Section 4. The second paradox: for years, scientists sought the ideal truth serum. Why, then, did they ultimately embrace a drug that made people perfectly susceptible to lies? The answer to this question will change your understanding of the project's true goals, and will be given in Section 3. These are not rhetorical questions. They have concrete answers based on documents the CIA tried to destroy. This investigation is not merely a collection of shocking facts. It is an anatomy of a state crime committed under the pretext of national security. By the end of this video, you will stop seeing MKUltra as just a series of mad experiments. You will see a clear mechanism that can be reproduced even today. First, you will understand how fear of an external threat, like Soviet brainwashing, is used as a justification for violating one's own laws. Second, you will see how absolute secrecy transforms protectors into aggressors. And third, you will realize why the most dangerous experiments on society are conducted not in enemy laboratories, but in respectable institutions, right here at home. Understanding this mechanism is the best defense against its repetition. We will show not only what the CIA did, but also why they got away with it. To understand the project's scale, our investigation will proceed through 3 key points. In a few minutes, we will descend into the personal laboratory of the CIA's dark wizard, Sidney Gottlieb. There, we will unravel the paradox of LSD and see what even darker arsenal he used to hack consciousness. Next, you will witness the project's most cynical operation, dubbed Operation Midnight Climax. We will show how CIA agents outfitted brothels with two-way mirrors to observe unwitting Americans under the influence of drugs. And finally, we will find ourselves in the U.S. Senate hearing room at the Church Committee. You will see the historical moment when America's dirtiest secret was brought to light, and understand why the CIA director ordered almost all evidence destroyed 2 years prior. In just 3 minutes, you will learn how the panicked fear of a Soviet threat became official permission to conduct any, even the most inhumane, experiments. At the peak of its post-war power in the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency was gripped by an irrational fear. At first glance, the reason seemed obvious. Reports indicated that American prisoners of war returning from Korea were publicly denouncing their own country. This gave rise to the theory of Soviet brainwashing technology and launched Project Bluebird, the first attempt to understand enemy methods. However, documents uncovered by the Church Committee painted a different picture. CIA Director Allen Dulles used this fear as a pretext. From the very beginning, the goal was not defensive, but offensive, to create their own, more powerful weapon of mind control. Panic became a tool to secure an unlimited budget. The term brainwashing itself had only been coined 3 years prior, in 1950, by journalist Edward Hunter. The Soviet methods the CIA studied were a combination of harsh but known techniques: sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, endless interrogations, and ideological indoctrination. They didn't work like a surgical instrument, but like soil erosion, slowly washing away the protective layer of personality, but unable to replace it with a new landscape. Yet internal agency memoranda show that they weren't interested in this reality. They dreamed of a Hollywood version, creating the ideal Manchurian candidate, an absolute puppet. They found no evidence that the Soviets possessed such technology. The conclusion was paradoxical. The CIA decided to create the weapon it feared, but which in reality did not exist. And the key to it lay not in psychology, but in chemistry, in molecules capable of directly hacking the brain. The agency was so convinced of the threat that it initiated internal investigations, attempting to find zombie agents among American officials. At first glance, there were suspicious cases. Any atypical behavior by a defector or prisoner was interpreted as the result of enemy influence. But the reality was unequivocal. After years of searching, not a single confirmed case of a Manchurian candidate was found. The result, 0 zombie agents, but millions of dollars spent chasing a ghost, a budget that could have built a destroyer. This vacuum of evidence did not stop the project, it became its main fuel. Dulles' logic was simple. If the enemy had not yet created this weapon, we must do it first. To open this Pandora's box, they needed a very particular person. The project received approval and funding. All that remained was to find its leader, a person with the mind of a scientist and a complete absence of moral restraints. At first glance, Sidney Gottlieb was the ideal candidate, a brilliant chemist with a PhD from Caltech, a specialist in poisons. But at the CIA, he had an unofficial nickname, the Dark Wizard. His personal interest in exotic poisons, psychotropics, and even sorcery made him not just an executor but the ideological driving force behind the most radical methods. A stuttering chemist with a congenital clubfoot, Gottlieb, according to biographers, spent his life seeking absolute control, first over nature, then over people. He was the one who could translate the leadership's immoral fantasies into real scientific experiments. Now we will descend into his personal laboratory and see why LSD became the ideal key to the human mind for him. Gottlieb's initial theory was deceptively simple. He believed that LSD, by causing depersonalization and ego dissolution, stripped a person of the very concept of self that needed to be protected by lies. Without an ego, there were no lies. However, experiments showed the opposite. In a state of personality disintegration, a person did not become truthful. Instead, they became absolutely suggestible, losing the ability to distinguish real memories from fantasies, and most importantly, from the experimenter's suggestions. This was a breakthrough. Gottlieb realized he had created not a lie detector, but an implanter of false ideas. He had found not a truth serum, but a chemical weapon for creating lies, which proved far more valuable to the CIA. But LSD was just the tip of the iceberg in his arsenal. Gottlieb acted not as a scientist, but as a wicked chef. His laboratory housed not only psychedelics but also hypnotic drugs, barbiturates for suppressing will, electroshock equipment, and exotic biological agents. At first glance, it was just a collection of disparate tools. However, the protocols reveal his true obsession, synergy. He created monstrous cocktails. Hypnosis sessions were conducted on individuals under the influence of LSD to bypass critical thinking. Electroshock was used to clear memory before implanting. New directives. LSD softened the consciousness, after which hypnosis, like a knife, and electroshock, like a hammer, could inflict maximum damage. The goal was not mere manipulation, but a technology for complete erasure and rewriting of personality. To test it, he needed subjects who could not complain. The testing ground became the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, led by Dr. Ewan Cameron, a CIA contractor. Ordinary people, such as those with postpartum depression, were admitted here. Cameron called his method psychic driving. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks, sometimes months. In this state, the same audio recording with simple commands was played to them through headphones up to 500,000 times. The true goal was not treatment, but to test the CIA's hypothesis of complete personality depatterning. The result was a terrifying discovery. It was possible to erase memory and personality, but not to record a new one. Patients emerged from comas, not recognizing their children, having become empty vessels. Some were kept in a coma for up to 86 consecutive days. The experiment's failure did not stop the CIA, it only demanded a larger scale of operations. Conducting such cruel experiments in official clinics was too risky. The CIA needed complete autonomy and impunity. Ostensibly, they simply used standard safe-house practices for clandestine meetings. However, the reality was different. Allen Dulles and Sidney Gottlieb built an extensive, illegal infrastructure within the U.S., hidden not only from the public but also from most agency employees. This invisible empire allowed them to operate in ways they couldn't even in enemy territory. The budget just for maintaining secret apartments in New York and San Francisco amounted to $150,000 per year. Have you ever wondered what might be happening behind the wall of a neighboring apartment in an ordinary building? The number is staggering: 149 sub-projects in 80 institutions, including 44 universities and 12 hospitals. How could an operation of this scale be hidden? The answer lies in the funding scheme. The CIA created front scientific organizations, such as the Human Ecology Fund. These funds acted as conduits for dirty money. Passing through them, agency funds transformed into respectable grants. This didn't just conceal the source, it corrupted American science. Prestigious universities conducted unethical experiments on students for money whose origin they consciously chose not to scrutinize. Formally, the CIA was not operating in the U.S., it was merely funding independent researchers. This was a perfect legal loophole. But for the dirtiest tests, they needed a completely controlled environment. Ostensibly, these were ordinary safe houses. Inside, soundproofing, hidden cameras, and drug supplies. However, the key element of these laboratories was not technology, but people. For fieldwork, the CIA recruited not scientists, but former narcotics agents. Individuals like George White, an operative who boasted that his hands were bloody. Their task was not research, but the brutal testing of Gottlieb's methods in real-world conditions. This turned the apartments into torture chambers. One question remained: how to lure random people there? The answer was strikingly simple and cynical. The operation was named Midnight Climax. The CIA entered the sex trade. They hired prostitutes in San Francisco, paying them up to $100 a night to bring their clients to safe houses. The victims were completely random people: sailors, tourists, businessmen. They were not enemies of the state. They were simply convenient and rightless material for experiments. But what happened behind the walls of these apartments was even worse than the deception itself. Inside, the prostitutes, following instructions, slipped LSD into the clients' drinks. It seemed like a simple field test of the drug. But one detail transformed this experiment into a theater of cruelty. Behind the bedroom wall, behind a two-way mirror, sat CIA agents. They observed everything happening in real time. Declassified testimonies indicate that they often turned it into a party, sipping martinis and indifferently taking notes on human suffering. This was not scientific research, but a voyeuristic show. Now, we will look behind that two-way mirror and see the operation through the eyes of its creators. San Francisco, the beatnik era. A man, perhaps a sailor on leave, meets a woman in a bar. She invites him to her apartment at 225 Chestnut Street. From the window, there's a view of the bay. For him, it's the promise of a luxurious night. For the CIA, it's field laboratory number 3. She offers him a drink. A few minutes later, the world begins to swim. He doesn't understand what's happening. His confusion gives way to panic. At this moment, we change perspective. The mirror in the bedroom is two-way. Behind it, in the darkness, an agent sits, methodically recording every detail: words, fears, involuntary reactions. They weren't just studying the effect of LSD. They were looking for vulnerabilities. Could this person be made to reveal a secret? Could they be blackmailed? This was a laboratory for creating compromising material. At first glance, the choice of prostitutes as operatives was cynical but pragmatic. They easily lured men, and their word in court was worthless, ensuring the operation's security. However, the scientific goal was deeper. Could combining sex, drugs, and the fear of exposure lead to absolute control over a person? They sought a universal hook for recruitment and interrogations. But the Church Committee reports show that the operation was a complete scientific failure. Over nearly 10 years, not a single piece of valuable intelligence was obtained. Thousands of hours of observation and hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars were spent gathering utterly useless information. It was a senseless and cruel amusement at government expense. This theater was not led by Sidney Gottlieb, but by a specially hired agent from the Bureau of Narcotics, George White, a man who fit perfectly into the criminal world and enjoyed his work. His personal diaries, found after his death, reveal his true attitude towards what was happening. With dark humor, he described sitting on the toilet behind the mirror, watching the performances his victims put on. For him, it wasn't work, but a privilege. White and his team were confident in their absolute impunity, reveling in their power over broken people. They considered themselves untouchable. But how did they treat each other? Within this closed circle, at first glance, Gottlieb's team was bound by shared secrecy and should have followed strict protocols. The reality was different. Experiments on each other, often without warning, were the norm and part of the corporate culture. For them, a sudden trip was something akin to a reflex check, a painful but necessary test of endurance. During one such off-site meeting in the secluded cottage on Deep Creek Lake, Gottlieb slipped LSD into the drinks of his colleagues, including Frank Olson. For him, it was routine. But Olson's paranoid reaction triggered a chain of events that, 9 days later, led to his mysterious death. This is the story of a man who knew too much. At first glance, Frank Olson was simply the victim of a failed experiment. However, his reaction was more than just paranoia. He was a high-ranking biological weapons specialist from Fort Detrick. He knew about the CIA's plans to use poisons for assassinations. His sudden desire to resign transformed him from a valuable asset into a walking national security threat. Therefore, when he was sent to New York, it was not a rescue mission. The agent accompanying him was not a caregiver, but a guard. And the psychiatrist he was taken to was a hypnosis specialist working for MKUltra. This was a damage control operation, an operation that ended with a fall from the 13th floor window of the Statler Hotel. The official report from the CIA and police was simple: suicide due to a nervous breakdown. The agent who was with him in the room claimed he was asleep and heard nothing. The case was closed. But this version falls apart with one detail. The hotel. Switchboard operator heard Olson's last words on the phone. "They've taken me for someone else." 22 years later, after the initial revelations, the family secured an exhumation of the body. The results of the second autopsy were unequivocal. A hematoma from a severe blow with a blunt object inflicted before the fall was found on Olson's skull. He was first stunned, then thrown from the window. This was not suicide, but a disguised murder, the first proven deadly consequence of the MKUltra program. While Olson's family mourned a supposed suicide, the CIA used his death as a lesson. Agency representatives met with his widow, expressed condolences, and concealed all information about LSD, allegedly to protect the deceased's reputation. The lie was presented as an act of compassion. But within the agency, Olson's death became not a cause for investigation, but a signal that the program was not sufficiently protected. Sidney Gottlieb and Alan Dulles concluded secrecy protocols needed to be tightened. The tragedy of one man became the system's justification for creating even more impenetrable armor. The project was not shut down. It expanded to 149 sub-projects. For decades, this armor seemed invulnerable. But in 1973, the Watergate scandal created an atmosphere of total distrust towards intelligence agencies. CIA Director Richard Helms felt threatened. He issued an oral order to destroy all MKUltra archives. At first glance, this was a standard cleanup. However, the order concerned exclusively this project. It was a panicked attempt to erase the program from history. The attempt to destroy evidence itself became the primary evidence, proving that the CIA had something to hide. The order almost worked, but agents missed one type of document that is never stored in research archives. They missed the financial reports. In the battle for truth, the decisive weapon turned out to be not spy testimonies, but dull accounting ledgers. At first glance, the Church Committee investigators in 1975 were at a dead end. They interrogated agents, but hit a wall of silence, amnesia, state secrets, outright lies. However, reality delivered a blow from the financial department. Among thousands of budget documents, Funding requests were found that had mistakenly not fallen under the destruction order. These papers became a map. Brothels in San Francisco were listed as safe house maintenance. Following this money trail, investigators uncovered the entire network, which led them directly to the project's chief accountant, Sidney Gottlieb. Armed with irrefutable invoices, the committee summoned the dark wizard to testify. A silence hung in the hearing room. Gottlieb, a man who had operated in the shadows for decades, appeared confident. In the initial phase of the hearings, his tactic worked. To senators' questions, he replied, "I don't recall the details. It was necessary for national security." It seemed it would be just another political show. But then Senator Frank Church changed tactics. Instead of general questions, he began reading lines from financial reports. "Mr. Gottlieb, explain the payment to this university for disorientation research. Explain the bill for the purchase of hallucinogenic drugs." Each document was a blow. The culmination was the estimate for outfitting these apartments in San Francisco. Cornered, Gottlieb confessed under oath that he had directed a program in which unsuspecting U.S. citizens were given LSD. Such confessions should have led to arrests. The public was outraged. Newspapers ran headlines about the CIA's laboratories of horror. At first glance, the system reacted. President Gerald Ford issued an executive order prohibiting human experiments without consent. The Senate introduced new oversight mechanisms. However, here's the bitter truth. Due to the destruction of key documents, prosecutors lacked direct evidence for murder charges. The statute of limitations had expired for other crimes. The result? 0 people were convicted. Sidney Gottlieb retired peacefully, raised goats, and died in his home 24 years later. His only punishment was that his name entered history forever. The story of MKUltra seems complete, the secret revealed, the program closed. But it was not an end, but a rebranding. Ostensibly, society learned a lesson, and MKUltra was considered a mistake of the past. However, the reality was different. The knowledge gained during the program never disappeared. The developments in sensory deprivation and psychological pressure formed the basis for future enhanced interrogation methods, which were used in prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo after 9/11. The idea that a person could be broken to obtain information did not die in 1975. It simply waited for a new crisis to revive. For thousands of nameless MKUltra victims, the main consequence was not the trauma itself, but the inability to prove its cause. The program was exposed, but the involvement of specific individuals was not. At first glance, justice prevailed. After the revelations, Frank Olson's family and a few other affected individuals were able to obtain compensation through the courts. However, the reality was striking. These were isolated cases. For the vast majority, the destruction of documents became a life sentence. How could a person suffering from inexplicable psychoses since the 1960s prove it was the result of LSD given to them in a hospital under the guise of new medicine if all records were burned? The CIA didn't just break these people's psyches. It stole from them the very cause of their suffering. This theft of the past gave rise not only to personal tragedies, but also to a nationwide paranoia that fueled the most incredible theories. Where does the belief come from that the government controls us through chips or 5G towers? The root of these seemingly absurd ideas lies in an absolutely real and proven government program. At first glance, conspiracy theories are a product of ignorance. However, reality is more complex. MKUltra created a cultural precedent. Proven facts, secret laboratories in universities, the use of prostitutes for experiments, the murder of scientists, attempts to create a Manchurian candidate. All sound like a Hollywood thriller. When reality is so insane, it makes any theory, even the most fantastic, potentially possible. MKUltra forever shifted the center of gravity of public consciousness. It placed such a heavy and real stone on the scales of possibility that now any, even the lightest, conspiracy theory seems capable of tipping them. While some plunged into these theories, others turned the shocking truth into entertainment. What do the series Stranger Things, the film Joker, and the Call of Duty Black Ops game series have in common? All of them directly or indirectly use the history of MKUltra. At first glance, this is simply borrowing facts to create engaging stories. But in reality, the influence was much deeper. MKUltra didn't just provide plots, it shaped archetypes that we now take for granted. The image of a scientist playing God and a sinister shadow organization has become a cultural trope. The transformation of MKUltra into a pop culture phenomenon has a reverse effect. It trivializes the real horror. By consuming stories about a telekinetic girl escaping a lab, we are entertained, forgetting that behind this are real people whose lives were destroyed in real laboratories. We have seen how the program broke lives and bred distrust. In the finale, we will combine all of this into a single formula. We have examined the history of MKUltra from various angles, but can it be reduced to one simple and frightening formula? At first glance, it's a tangle of many factors: the Cold War, specific individuals, scientific misconceptions. However, if you look closely, all these elements combine into a universal recipe. Here is that formula: existential fear plus absolute secrecy, multiplied by a lack of oversight, equals abuse of power. MKUltra is not an anomaly, but a logical result of applying this formula. It is not tied to the 1950s. It can work in any era, with any technology, and in any country. In the final section, we will answer the main question that arises from this formula. Can something similar happen again today? And what is the only antidote? At the beginning of this investigation, we asked ourselves, how could this have happened? Now, having put all the pieces together, we see that MKUltra was not an accident. It was the logical result of the very formula we discussed. Fear, that was the paranoia of the Cold War, and the panic over Soviet brainwashing, which allowed the project to be launched. Secrecy, that was the absolute carte blanche that Alan Dulles gave Sidney Gottlieb, allowing him to create an invisible empire of front foundations and secret laboratories where Operation Midnight Climax was conducted. When these two components are multiplied by a complete lack of oversight, both legislative and internal, the result is tragedy. And this tragedy has a specific name: Frank Olson. This formula is the main tool we have gained. It allows us to analyze not only the past but also the present. Now we can answer the central mystery: how did an agency created for protection turn into an aggressor against its own citizens? The answer lies in a shift of focus. At first glance, the enemy was the Soviet Union. But within MKUltra, the true enemy became the unpredictability of human consciousness itself. The CIA, through Gottlieb, sought not merely to defeat the communists, but to hack human will, to find universal buttons for controlling behavior. When the goal becomes so total, any person, an enemy spy, a random sailor in a brothel, or even their own employee, is transformed from an individual into an object of research. They were able to do this because they stopped seeing Americans as people to protect and began seeing them as experimental material. The agency began to act like a lumberjack who looks at a living forest and sees not trees, but only cubic meters of timber. This was a fundamental betrayal of the social contract. What conclusion should we draw for ourselves today? It is simple and uncomfortable. MKUltra is not a system error. It is a property of the system under certain conditions. Any intelligence agency in any country, given complete secrecy and a lack of accountability, will go down the same path. This is not a matter of nationality or ideology. It is a matter of the nature of power. The only thing that stopped MKUltra was not internal remorse, but external intervention. The Church Committee, despite its inability to punish the guilty, fulfilled its main function. It brought the secret to light. Transparency proved to be the only weapon against absolute secrecy. In the age of digital technologies, when the possibilities for control are immeasurably greater than in Gottlieb's time, demanding accountability from power structures is a matter of survival. As Senator Frank Church himself said in 1975, "The capacity for tyranny is inherent in our technology." We have completed this investigation. Now we want to ask you one final question to understand what conclusion you have drawn for yourself. In the history of MKUltra, there are two main driving forces. On one side, there are the ambitions and malice of specific individuals, such as Sidney Gottlieb, who reveled in his power as the Dark Wizard, or Alan Dulles, who covered for him for his own ends. If you believe the root of evil lies in such personalities, write the word people in the comments. On the other side, there is the indifference and inertia of a vast state system that created the conditions for complete secrecy, failed to provide oversight, and did not punish the guilty. If you believe the problem lies in such an impersonal machine, write the word system in the comments. People or system. Your answer will show what we fear more, the evil will of one person or the soulless logic of a state machine. Thank you for watching.